Welcome to today's presentation. I am so excited to introduce you to Evan Weiner. He is a journalist since 1971. He's worked in radio and TV for many, many years, and I just literally can't wait for you guys to talk to him. In the last, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes that we've been catching up and getting set up, I have learned a lot, and I could listen to him talk forever. So I am very, very, very excited to welcome Evan Weiner. Take it away.
Thank you, Katie, for inviting me. And hello, Chicago. I knew Ron Santo, and I knew Harry Carey and Mike Ditka and others. I've been a journalist since I'm 15 years old. By the age of 21, which was in March of 1978, I ended up on WNEW radio, 50,000 watt station in New York, doing some news for them, thanks to John Lindsay. I had a scoop with him and ended up on WNEW. You're probably unfamiliar with WNEW, but that was the station that had William B. Williams. And William B. Williams gave Frank Sinatra his nickname, the chairman of the board. My Chicago story, I'll give you a quick one. I worked with John Madden for about 15 years. The football coach turned announcer on CBS and ABC and NBC. And Michael Frank was his assistant. And I'm going to tell you a quick Chicago story about John Madden. Michael Frank said to me, did I ever tell you the story about the Drake Hotel? I said, no. He says, oh, okay. Mike was John's aide de camp. He was his right-hand man for a little while. And Michael said, they go into the Drake Hotel and they check into the Drake Hotel and they go to the elevator, and he says, this little English guy comes up to John Madden and he says, John, Mr. Madden, I want to just tell you I'm an English guy and I love you. I love watching football with you. You've taught me everything about football. I could actually sit there and watch it and understand it thanks to you. You know, it's great. I just want to shake your hand. You're great, you're great, you're great. They're in the elevator. This guy walks off the elevator and goes to wherever he's going. And John turns to Michael Frank and he says, you know that guy? He says, yeah. Don't you know who he is? He says, no. He says, he's Mick Jagger. He said, who? He said, Mick Jagger. Who? Mick Jagger. He says, hey, you know, he sung, I ain't got no satisfaction. And John looks at Michael and he says, I could see he got no satisfaction. He had no idea who Mick Jagger was. Long story made shorter. Years later, the Rolling Stones did the opening for the ABC Monday Night Football, of which John was the announcer. That's my Drake Hotel story. I have other Chicago stories, but I'm not going to tell you right now. That is Marianne Vecchio, and it is 1970. It is May 4th, 1970, the 50th anniversary of the Kent State shootings. That is a Pulitzer Prize winning photo taken by a student who was watching this 14, 15-year-old run away crying for help as one of the protesters at Kent State was killed by the Ohio National Guard. A lot of tension in 1970 on the college campuses around the country. And there was just a spillover from 1967. In fact, the first college protest was at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And it wasn't necessarily a protest against the war. It was a protest against Dow Chemical, because they were recruiting scientists and they were making Agent Orange, and that got the ball rolling for campus demonstrations. And by October 1967, they were in full swing around the country. That is Marianne Vecchio, who goes back to Kent State on occasion to discuss why she was there. She was a runaway. She happened to be there, and what happened that day. 1970, and particularly in the spring into the summer of 1970, you might see pictures like this from Seattle, where the police are on I-5. My daughter actually lives in Seattle, not very far to the right of your screen, not very far to where this demonstration took place. Demonstrators stopping traffic on I-5 going down toward California, and the police ready at hand in case any violence breaks out. Oh, there he is, Richard Nixon. I got to know Richard Nixon in 1985. He comes back into public life in 1985 because he was the arbitrator of the Major League Baseball umpires dispute. The owners and the umpires were far apart. Peter Ueberroth was the commissioner of baseball. I was covering sports at that point. And Richie Phillips was the guy who is the chief negotiator for the Baseball Umpires Association. And they're getting nowhere real fast in the talks. And Richie lived in Society Hill off the main line in Philadelphia. And Richard Nixon lived near me in Park Ridge, New Jersey, not too far, 20 minutes from me. But his son-in-law, David Eisenhower and Julie, David and Julie, lived next door to Richie Phillips. And Richie Phillips is going back and forth with Peter Ueberroth, and he says, hey, I got an idea. He says, and Ueberroth says, what's the idea? He says, how about arbitration? He says, well, who do you got in mind? He said, Dick Nixon. He said, Dick Nixon, get out of here. No, Dick Nixon. So how do you know Dick Nixon? He says, well, Julie and David are my next door neighbors, and I see Dick and Pat every weekend. They're down there babysitting the grandkids. Can't imagine Dick Nixon as a grandparent, but he was. And Ueberroth took him up on the idea. So I get a call one day that Nixon is going to be the arbitrator. So I run down to Foley Square, which is across from the Southern District Courthouse in Lower Manhattan. And there he is, Dick Nixon. And I got to, I wouldn't say be more than just somebody who I used to see, but he did know my name. And he did get back into the public, not because of David Frost, but because of what he did with the umpires. And he gave the umpires a big raise, and he became welcomed back into proper society with that. And I used to see him a lot at Yankee Stadium and Shea Stadium, to the point where he did know my name, and I would call him Mr. President, and he would say, no, call me Dick. And that was it, Dick Nixon. But here he is in 1970 when he decides to go meet with protesters after Kent State. Vietnam, of course, war is still raging in Vietnam. The calendar does flip to 1970, but the problems from the Summer of Love, 1967, or 1968, or 1969, none of that disappears. The Vietnam War is still raging. The Biafra War does end with Nigeria in January of 1970. The Middle East remains a powder keg, but it's not because of Israel this time. It is problems between the Palestinian Liberation Organization and King Hussein of Jordan. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union continues. Americans win the race to the moon, but that doesn't end the Cold War. There is also some isolation between China and the Soviet Union, and Mao Zedong is looking at the United States to maybe become friends at some point. And racial divisions remain in America. The Biafra War, you might remember this picture. I certainly do, from when I was 12, 13 years old, watching TV and watching the CARE commercials about sending money to CARE so they could give money to children, starving children, dying children in Biafra. That war starts in 1967. It's the Nigerian Civil War. July 6th of 1967, it lasts until 1970, about 2.5 years, all told. Biafra, which was in the southern part of Nigeria, represented the nationalist aspirations of the Biafrans, who felt that could no longer exist with the northern-dominated federal government. But the shouting's all over by 1968. Nigerian troops surrounded Biafra, and they caught or captured the coastal oil facilities in the city of Port Harcourt. The blockade led to mass starvation, 2.5 years of war, 100,000 military casualties, and the estimate between 500,000 and 2 million Biafran civilians would die of starvation. And that is the flag of Biafra, a short-lived country for about 2.5 years, and a country not really recognized by too many people around the world. The British forces came in to help the Nigerians in 1967 and 68, and there was a total blockade of the Nigerian, rather the Biafran area, and eventually the Biafran forces surrendered to the Nigerian military government. There's been some smoldering, some sparks over the last 50 years, but nothing really from the Biafrans who are part of Nigeria. Nuclear proliferation also on the minds at the people over at the UN, down the road from me, about 12 miles. In March, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty went into effect. The purpose of the treaty was to prevent the further spread and creation of nuclear weapons and to work towards complete disarmament for nations to cooperate with one another in safe development of nuclear energy. As I said, Vietnam was going on. I knew some people who served in Vietnam. One of them who had the worst job in the world after getting wounded, he came back to the New York area, and to fulfill his military service, he wasn't wounded terribly, had shrapnel on the shoulder. He had to go knock on the doors of those who lost their loved ones in Vietnam. He told me it was the worst job imaginable, absolutely imaginable. His name is Don Gould. He ended up on TV. He was on the Today Show for a while, and he told me all about how awful it was to tell the families that their loved one was killed in Vietnam. Why was the United States in Vietnam? Well, it goes back to August 7th, 1964, but 1963, there were 3 troops killed in Vietnam. There was a plane that crashed going to Vietnam in 1962 carrying military people. But on August 7th, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and that gave Lyndon Johnson the authority, President of the United States, to take all necessary actions to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression by the communist government of North Vietnam. This all comes on the heels of an alleged attack on 2 U.S. naval destroyers stationed off the coast of Vietnam. The Gulf Tonkin Resolution effectively launched America's full-scale involvement in the Vietnam War, although starting around 1954, after the French got out of Vietnam, which became a civil war between the North and South, Americans were slated to go to North Vietnam or South Vietnam, and I know because my father had mentioned that to me. He was in the Army at that point, and he thought he was going to Vietnam in 1954. It would take 10 years before full-scale involvement occurred. Richard Nixon. Oh, Richard Nixon, the great silent majority. That starts actually in November of 1969, November 3rd of 1969. Term popularized by the U.S. President Nixon in a speech, November 3rd, 69. And so tonight to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. He wants to make sure he's got everybody on board about finishing the job in Vietnam. A Nixon administration official clarified Nixon's concept of silent majority as a large and normally undemonstrative cross-section of the country that until last night refrained from articulating its opinions on the war. Nixon referred to the vast majority of Americans who did not take part in the mass demonstrations against the Vietnam War, nor participate in the counterculture. Nobody's ever explained to me exactly what counterculture is. It's a word that was made up, but nobody seems to know what exactly the counterculture was. Were they protesters? Were they hippies? Well, hippies died October 6, 1967 in San Francisco. The Diggers had a funeral for the hippies, the end of the hippies. The hippies left no doctrines. No, there's nothing left behind in writing, although people still use the term hippie. There was no such thing as a hippie philosophy. And public discourse in the country. Those were not only the older generation, but the World War II veterans, also the young in the West, Midwest, and the South. The Nixon people wrote off the Northeast totally, that entire area, the I-95 corridor between Washington, D.C. and Boston, they wrote off. Many of whom would eventually serve in Vietnam. That is Carl McIntyre, Reverend Carl McIntyre and his wife, Ferry, and they were protesting on April 4th, 1970 for Vietnam War and to support the troops. With Bible in hand, the Reverend Carl McIntyre and his wife, Fairy McIntyre, led the March for Victory on Pennsylvania Avenue on April 4th, 1970, which, by the way, was the second anniversary of the killing of Martin Luther King. McIntyre said his parade was a demonstration for military victory in Vietnam, and he had people like Lester Maddox, the segregationist, the governor of Georgia, speak before the crowd. Maddox would come back into prominence later that year in the most unlikely of circumstances, which I'll get to a little later in the talk. Lester Maddox, restaurant owner, governor of Georgia. Just in case some of you communists, socialists, and other integrationists have any doubt, the Pickrick, which was his chicken restaurant, the Pickrick, will never be integrated. If you want some fried chicken, it'll have to be something other than Pickrick chicken. Lester Maddox was the governor of Georgia at the time. As this is all going on, all of this is going on, there's a guy by the name of Norman Lear, along with his partner Bud Yorkin, and they're trying to shop a television show. And they started trying to shop this television show in 1968, both to ABC and CBS. Around this time, CBS said, yes, we want the show, and we want it to start in January of 1971. The show is called All in the Family. All the scripts written for January and February of 1971 depicted the events that were going on in 1970. So there's a little lag left behind. And of course, there is Sammy Davis Jr. and Carol O'Connor, Archie Bunker, in the 1971 show. But Norman Lear is now watching intently what is going on around the country because he has a TV show, a satirical TV show, and he has plenty of material to work with. Back to the silent majority, like Archie Bunker, many Americans, particularly working class and middle class whites, responded to the turbulence of the late 1960s, the urban riots, the anti-war protests, like the Chicago Democratic National Convention in 1968, the alienating counterculture. Again, I'm not sure what the counterculture was, by embracing a new kind of conservative populism. They were sick, according to the Nixon officials, they were sick of what they interpreted as spoiled hippies. Like I said, the hippies were gone in 1967, whining protesters, tired of interfering government that, in their view, coddled poor people and black people at taxpayers' expense. These individuals, according to the Nixon people, formed what political strategists would eventually call the silent majority. Vietnam is heavy on Nixon's mind. Now, on November 15th, 1969, about 2 million people protested outside of the White House. It was a moratorium day against the Vietnam War. Nixon is watching this from inside the White House, obviously hears the protesters, but in November 15th, 1969, he said, "I'll never waver." He was sturdy. He was strong as to go. He was steady. He was that steady in November of 1969. On April 20th, Nixon announced that he would be withdrawing more than 100,000 troops from Vietnam. However, and some of you who might have gone to college at that time or might have been in high school at the time, and you are of a certain age, roughly between 66 and 74, less than 2 weeks later, the United States invaded Cambodia, which would extend the war and seemingly preclude further withdrawals. That's Cambodia there, Thailand there, South Vietnam here, Laos over there. It's Richard Nixon explaining what is going on in Cambodia. The Cambodian invasion was a series of military operations conducted in eastern Cambodia during 1970. The invasions were a policy of President Richard Nixon. 13 major operations conducted by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam between April 29th in July 22nd, and by U.S. Armed Forces May 1st through May 30th. And the unrest in the country would start. And again, like in 1968, it seemingly the United States was being pulled apart. Kent State University, May 7th, 1970. For some of you people who like sports here, you might recognize the name Steve Albert. He was an NBA announcer. He was on campus on May 4th, 1970 as a student at Kent State University. I asked him a couple times about what happened that day, and he really didn't want to talk about it. That was the day the Ohio National Guard opened fire on protesters. James Rhodes, who was the governor of Ohio at the time, decided that the National Guard needed to be sent to Kent, Ohio, to Kent State to quell whatever was going on at the campus at Kent State University. The Kent State shootings, May 4th, 1970. Members of the Ohio National Guard shot unarmed college students, and there would be a report called the Scranton Report that would come out that would back up the unarmed college students during a mass protest against the bombing of Cambodia by the United States military. 28 National Guardsmen, or Ohio Guardsmen, fired approximately 67 rounds over 13 seconds, killing 4 students, wounding 9 others, one of whom would suffer permanent paralysis. Some of the students who were shot had been protesting against the Cambodian campaign. Nixon announced that during a television address April 30th that year. Other students were shot, had been walking nearby or observing the protests from a distance. And that is the famous Pulitzer Prize winning picture of Marianne Vecchio, about 14 years old at the time, just happened to be there screaming over the dead body. Many angry students were ready to launch an all-out attack on the National Guard, but they had no weaponry. Many of the faculty members, and they were led by a geology professor by the name of Glenn Frank, pleaded with the students, leave the commons area. 20 minutes after speaking, the students left the commons area, and the ambulance people were finally able to get in there to tend to the wounded. The National Guard would leave the area. That would spark protests around the country on college campuses. 450 campuses would close immediately, both violent and non-violent demonstrations. Kent State was not the only college campus that saw military action that either killed people, or police action that either killed people or wounded people. In Buffalo, New York, that's Main Street in Buffalo, New York, the cops are out, the demonstrators are out in the street, and they're not only college students, they're high school students. This is May of 1970. Graduating seniors are out there. Juniors who are 1 year away from possibly being drafted are out there. Sophomores who are 2 years away were out there. I was 14 years old leaving 9th grade, but I was a year ahead. So I had 4 years to worry about that at that particular time. In Buffalo, after the Kent State killing, thousands marched down Main Street. High school students joined in. Club swinging Buffalo police fired tear gas. Rocks were hurled through bank windows. The students were tear gassed. On May 7th at SUNY Buffalo, State University of New York at Buffalo, police filled the student union with tear gas and birdshot. 4 students wounded. 4 students were up to 4 killed and 9 students, 13 students wounded at this point. That is the University of New Mexico. Man, I'd love to have those pants. On the left, I had a pair of pants like that when I was a teenager. Anyway, some of you might have had pants like that too. Anyway, that is the New Mexico National Guard chasing demonstrators. 11 wounded, bayonet wounds. They were bayoneted by the New Mexico National Guard in a confrontation. The governor of the state, David Cargo, called in the National Guard because he got some false information that the state police were facing protesters who were armed and dangerous. They were neither armed nor they were dangerous, as the Scranton report would put out. That's in my neck of the woods. That's in front of near Wall Street, down in lower Manhattan, and that is the Hard Hat riot led by Peter Brennan, who ended up becoming Nixon's Secretary of Labor. There were kids in the front row there as people are demonstrating down near Wall Street. That was the days when radio actually covered things like riots. It wasn't quite a riot, but it was a lot of screaming and a lot of yelling in front of Federal Hall, where George Washington took the oath of office in 1787. That was May 8th of that year. And it was organized by Peter Brennan, and it was called the Hard Hat Riot. Incidentally, going back on that picture, Impeach the Red Mayor, that was John Lindsay. That Red Mayor was responsible for me at 21 to being on a big city radio station. It really launched my career in radio. John Lindsay was running for Senate in 1980 at the state of New York, and told me that. And that's how I ended up on WNEW radio, Impeach the Red Mayor. And there is Dick Nixon. Dick Nixon needs to talk to the protesters. He's having these contentious news conferences, and he's not getting any sleep, and things weird out for Richard Nixon here. There was that news conference 4 days after Kent State on May 8th, around 10 o'clock at night. He's done with the news conference explaining Cambodia, explaining everything else that's going on in college campuses, protests and all, and he wants to talk about it. But he also wants to do something else. So Nixon stays up to about 2:15 in the morning, makes some phone calls, sleeps for a couple hours, wakes up, puts on some classical music, Rachmaninoff, peers out the window at the gathering crowds in the mall, doesn't have his cottage cheese and ketchup yet. It's one of his favorites, cottage cheese and ketchup. He had that most every morning. Anyway, so he's plotting and he's thinking, watching the crowds out in the mall in front of the White House, and he comes up with a scheme. He's going to take his valet, the Cuban immigrant, Manolo Sanchez, down to the Lincoln Memorial, because Sanchez has never seen the Lincoln Memorial in the light, and he decides, or rather in the dark with the light shining on, he decides, you know, let's go see it, which has problems because he's got to get the Secret Service together, and they have to go in the car together. Also, Manolo could see the Lincoln Memorial, and there it is. That's what he wants Sanchez to see, bathe in the light. So Nixon wants him to have that opportunity to see the lit Lincoln Memorial. And not only that, maybe, just maybe, Dick Nixon can be charming to some of the young anti-war protesters. So they hurry up, Nixon gets dressed, they all pile in cars, they leave at about 4:35 in the morning, and Nixon accomplishes goal one. He gets Sanchez to see the lighting. But Nixon really isn't there to make his valet all that happy. No. Well, it's good that his valet did see it, but he decides he is going to talk to the protesters, and he wants to know what's going on. Now, Richard Nixon, I dealt with him about 20 times, kept count, this is Nixon. Not one much for small talk. Not really one much for, just a little back and forth. Anyway, Nixon decides he's going to start with some small talk. Afterwards, the students were interviewed by the Washington Post to ask, well, what was going on with Dick Nixon talking to you? And one kid says, or one of the protesters says, to get the conversation going, well, this is Nixon actually talking about that. To get the conversation going, I asked how old they were, what they were studying, the usual questions. When several of the students said they were attending Syracuse University, this is the Washington Post part, Nixon commented on how good the school's football team was. I guess Syracuse had a good football team. They used to have good running backs, Jimmy Brown, Floyd Little, Ernie Davis. So he started talking about that. One of the protesters told the Washington Post, I hope it was because he was tired, but most of what he was saying was absurd. Here we had come from a university, Syracuse, upstate New York, that's completely uptight on strike. And when we told him where we were from, he talked about the football team. And when someone said he was from California, Nixon talked about surfing. Can you imagine Richard Nixon hanging 10? I don't know. I don't know. But he talked about surfing. So Dick Nixon was fully engaged with the student activists, people who would later be in front of the White House, carrying signs like impeach Nixon. Nixon's rambling dialogue ranged from travel to marriage to race relations and pollution. He did start the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. But eventually the president got around to his primary purpose, explaining his recent actions on Vietnam as motivated for a desire for peace. Nixon. I had tried to explain in the press conference that my goals in Vietnam were the same as theirs, to stop the killing, to end the war, to bring peace. Our goal was not to get into Cambodia by what we were doing, but to get out of Vietnam. There seemed to be they didn't respond. I had hoped their hatred of the war, which I could very well understand, would not turn into a bitter hatred of the whole system, our country and everything it stood for. I said, I know you, that probably most of you think I'm an SOB, but I want you to know that I understand just how you feel. And with that, Nixon leaves. And he goes to Capitol Hill because he wants breakfast. And he takes Sanchez with him. The detail goes over to the Capitol, and they go through the House of Representatives, where he served between 1947 and 1953. And they walk through the deserted building, and here's Nixon as a tour guide. Look at that, look at that, look at that. They finally get into the House chamber, and Nixon goes to his old seat. He goes to his old seat, and he tells Manolo, go up and give a speech, deliver a short speech. Manolo does. And then it's time for breakfast. He hadn't had any hashed brown potatoes since he'd become president, and he knew that the cafeteria in Capitol Hill had great hash browns, except it was closed. So they go off to the Mayflower Hotel, and they have breakfast, and he goes back to the Oval Office, and he meets with Kissinger, and he meets with his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. Kissinger was a security advisor at the time, Henry Kissinger, and there was Haldeman. Haldeman writes in his diary that day, after the Lincoln Memorial visit, I'm concerned about his condition. And he notes that Nixon's behavior that morning constituted the weirdest day so far. It is just a number of months, 6 months after Nixon said steady as they go on November 15th, 1969. And here's Henry Kissinger worrying about Richard Nixon having a nervous breakdown. Now, I told you there was more than Kent State. There was Jackson State where students were killed. May 15th, city and state police, Mississippi police, Jackson City police, killed 2 and wound 12. At Jackson State College, six killed. Another with this 23 plus the 9 in Kent State 32. Those are body counts. Those are body counts that you used to hear in the morning with the Vietnam War. 6 killed, 32 wounded on college and university campuses. Jackson State College, now Jackson State University. 900 campuses would eventually close. 35,000 National Guardsmen were mobilized, 21 campuses occupied. Students who were taking classes during the spring of 1970 were given options about their final grades, pass or fail, or take the top 3 tests. You could throw out one, divide it, and get an average, and that would be your grade. Nixon's advisor, Henry Kissinger, said the entire crisis left Nixon on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The Scranton report, William Scranton was the governor of Pennsylvania. Nixon ordered him to come up with a commission on campus unrest, which is what they did. They wanted to study the dissent, disorder, and violence breaking out on the college and university campuses across the nation. That started June 13th, 1970. The commission issued its findings in a September 1970 report that concluded that the Ohio National Guard shootings May 4th, 1970 were unjustified. Some of those guardsmen would eventually face trial and would be acquitted. Robert Dole would be the most unlikely person that you could think of to have legislation authorizing the United States to get out of Vietnam. Robert Dole was a young senator at that time, 50 years ago, from Kansas, had been a House member, got up to become senator. On June 24th, Mr. Dole, Senator Dole, who lost the use of one arm during World War II, highly decorated military man, offered an amendment to the Foreign Military Sales Act to undo the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It was 8110 to repeal it. On July 10th, 1970, the Senate 57-5 passed the concurrent resolution repealing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The July 10th vote, second time within 3 weeks, that the Senate voted to repeal the measure. The rest of the year in Vietnam, US President Nixon announces the United States would withdraw 40,000 troops before Christmas. November 10th, for the first time in 5 years, an entire week ends with no reports of combat fatalities in Southeast Asia. First time since 1965. More mundane things. Paul is quitting the Beatles. Yeah, Paul McCartney put out his own album complete with a news release or press release inside the cover of the album saying, that's it, it's gone. I got my own album now. The Beatles are over, never to be heard from again. Well, maybe not. The Beatles officially break up, at least in the media, in April of 1970, when McCartney states he's leaving the band. Lennon had left the band in September of 1969. Let It Be is released as their final album a month later. Had there been no COVID, well, I wouldn't be on Zoom talking to you, there would have been a 50th anniversary of the Let It Be album, complete with other goodies thrown into the box set released this year. The space program. Well, the United States won the war going to the moon, but there were more moon shots. Jack Swigert, who was on the Apollo 13 mission with Tom Hanks and Fred Hayes, Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes, tells Jack Lousmer, who's in Houston, monitoring what's going on between the spacecraft and the desk in Houston, okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. And Lousmer said, say again? And Jim Lovell said, Houston, we had a problem. Larry King, Houston, yeah, next. And there is the problem, the service module being blown up, or some of the oxygen tanks blown up on the service module. That is, well, it's not Tom Hanks, it's Jim Lovell, but Jim Lovell was played by Tom Hanks in the Apollo 13 movie, and Lovell played another character in that movie. Anyway, there's Lovell, Fred Hayes, and on the right, and Swaggart standing up. The Apollo 13 mission launched. It was the third mission to the moon. It carried Lovell, Swigert, and Hayes. The mission launched at 2:13 on April 11th, 1970. On April 13th, a lot of 13s here, right? A lot of 13s, unlucky number, allegedly. April 13th, at about 10:07 p.m. Eastern Time, a second oxygen tank explodes, causes issues with the other oxygen tanks. After about 3 hours, all of the oxygen stores are gone, loss of water, electricity, and the propulsion system. The only thing left is the lunar lander, which it was docked to at that point. I have a friend by the name of Dick Hull, Richard Hull. Richard Hull worked for NASA between 1960 and 75. He was part of the team that got the video back from the Apollo 11 mission while he was in Australia, and it was on Upside Down. I gave 2 talks where I talked about the Upside Down 1969 talk and getting to the moon, which Dick supplied a lot of information to. I bring up Dick, Richard Hull, because Richard Hull said that it was miraculous that these guys did get back. Crew was about 200,000 miles from Earth. There is Deke Slayton showing fibers that were put into the lunar module to keep carbon dioxide out from the command module, because all the astronauts went into the lunar module. And Dick Hull told me there were about 30 solutions on the table, 1 through 30. And number 30, the one that they thought least likely to work, was the one that worked. The one that they were most worried about, but it worked. And the best solutions they threw out. The crew spent 3.5 grueling days in the lunar module. They rationed food and water. Designers had intended to last 2.5 days while these guys were on the moon surface. Not 3 man days getting back to Earth. The carbon dioxide levels were dangerous levels. They converted some square filters to keep that out. It was 38 degrees inside the lunar module, and yet they reoriented the lunar module to return to Earth carrying the service module. It was difficult. There were obstacles in there, but Dick said that these guys performed flawlessly. They were able to navigate even though the functions were gone. There was debris from the explosion, which made it hard for the crew to navigate the stars using an onboard sextant. They were able to use the horizon of the Earth, where the Earth meets the horizon, as a reference point. They were able to control with slow burns how they were going back to Earth, and they made it back to Earth. April 17th, 1970, the crew splashed down in the Pacific Ocean near Samoa. There they are, Hayes on the left, Lovell in the middle, and Swigert on the right. And there's Tom Hanks as Jim Lovell. I knew a guy who knew Jim Lovell after this movie came out. And Lovell was on a press junket trying to sell the movie with Tom Hanks and Kevin Bacon. And the guy said, what was the most strangest part about being on this junket with Kevin Hanks, with Kevin Bacon, Tom Hanks? And when you were isolated, he said, people asking me, not about the mission, but whether Tom Hanks was a nice guy or not. The answer, Tom Hanks was a nice guy. Oh, there's Dick Nixon, and he's with King Hussein of Jordan. I have another friend of mine by the name of Bob Friedman. He's an instructor at Johns Hopkins University. He joined the military in 1965. 55 years ago as a young man. He was CIA for a while. He was an advisor to Yasser Arafat, to Israeli prime ministers, and he met with Arafat a number of times because he was an intermediary. I bring Bob Friedman up because Bob and I were talking about King Hussein one day, because he gives lectures on the Middle East. He's written books, F-R-E-E-D-M-A-N, Robert O. Friedman, if you want to look up his books about the Middle East. And he was talking about meeting King Hussein and going into the office and all of that. And with his wife, and his wife was not allowed in there initially because she had open-toed shoes. So she had to go out and buy shoes in the Mon, wear shoes so she could go in, because they don't allow open-toed shoes in King Hussein's or in the presidential palace. Anyway, make a long story short, Bob and his wife are waiting for King Hussein to come in, and Bob is looking around the room, and he sees 13 pictures hanging around the room. And he's thinking to himself, you know, all 13 of King Hussein's relatives died unnatural deaths. I wonder if he ever thinks about that being assassinated. Well, September 1st, 1970, September 1st, an assassination attempt against King Hussein of Jordan precipitates the Black September crisis within Jordan. September 15th, King Hussein of Jordan forms a military government with Mohammed Daoud as the prime minister. September 17th, Black September. You probably know Black September from the Munich Olympics in 1972. Black September, King Hussein of Jordan orders the Jordanian armed forces to house oust the Palestinian Fedayeen from Jordan. Black September 1970, a Middle East crisis has nothing to do with Israel. Black September was a conflict fought in Jordan between the Jordanian armed forces and the Palestinian Liberation Organization under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. Quick aside with Arafat. First time that Friedman meets with Arafat, it's in Tunis. Arafat's 3 hours late, and Yasser Arafat walks in and he says, Friedman, right? Yeah, kosher food's over there. Got specially for you. And Friedman says, I'm not here to talk about kosher food. I want to know what you said about in your speech, PLO speech. Don't bother listening. It's just for them. Go ahead and eat. And they went ahead and they talked about stuff. Anyway, and that was his first meeting with Arafat. Anyway, so Black September lasts between September 16th and 27th, 1970. Certain actions would continue until July 17th, 1971. There is Yasser Arafat. The Fedayeen acted as a state within the state. They disregarded local laws, regulations, tried to assassinate Hussein twice, which is why I brought up the Friedman conversation with me. And there were violent confrontations between them and the Jordanian army, and then eventually the Syrian army in June of 1970. The PLO hijacked a plane, Dawson's Field hijacking, September 6th, and the planes were brought down, the hostages were taken off, and the planes were blown up in front of the international media. The foreign nationals were taken as hostages, eventually were released. And there is Assad from Syria at that point. On September 17th, the Jordanian army was surrounding cities with PLO presence. They shelled the Fedayeen. The Syrians came in, painted their planes with Palestinian Liberation Army markings, intervened in support of the Fedayeen. They advanced to Ibid, which the Fedayeen declared a liberated city, but it wasn't long before the Syrian Air Force would again be gutted, like the Israelis did 3 years earlier, as the Jordanian army launched an air-to-ground offensive that inflicted heavy Syrian losses. Pressure mounted by Arab countries, and Hussein eventually stopped the fighting. On October 13th, he signed an agreement to regulate the Fedayeen's presence with Arafat. There's when they signed the agreement. The Jordanian army attacked again, January 71. They drove the Fedayeen one by one out of cities. Eventually, by July 17th, 1971, the 2,000 Fedayeen were surrounded by the Jordanian army in a forest, and the Jordanians allowed the Fedayeen to leave for Lebanon through Syria. Nasser. That is Nasser, the president of Egypt, and Arafat. Gamal Abdul Nasser dies on September 25th. Vice President Anwar Sadat named the temporary president of Egypt. He would get 90% of the vote October 15th of 1970 and become the president of Egypt. That is Charles de Gaulle in 1967, addressing a crowd in Montreal, prior to going to Expo 67 Montreal. Come on, come on, to Expo 67 Montreal. De Gaulle made a mistake, said, long live free Quebec. That was not something that the Canadian Prime Minister Lester Pearson, who is now remembered affectionately as an airport in Toronto, and as an American, you got to go through all sets of security. Going through that airport in Toronto. Not a fun trip for me, the times I've gone through Pearson. On July 24th, 67, de Gaulle shouted, Viva le Quebec, Viva le Quebec Libre, Viva la Quebec Libre. And gave an international voice to what was a sovereignist movement that was going on in Quebec to separate themselves from Canada. Caused a diplomatic incident. The Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, criticized the speech, saying de Gaulle's statements were unacceptable to the Canadian people. By 1970, Pierre Trudeau had enough and put an end to the terrorist group known as the Front de Liberation de Quebec after they kidnapped the provincial deputy premier Pierre Laporte and the British diplomat James Cross. These guys had been in business since 1963. Trudeau invokes the Canadian War Measures Act. The kidnappers murder Laporte. There are negotiations which leads to Cross's release, and the kidnappers are exiled to Cuba. From 63 to 70, there were 95 bombs detonated by the FLQ. Mailboxes, common targets, the largest single bombing, Montreal Stock Exchange, February 13th, 69, and injured 27 people. FLQ members stole dynamite from military and industrial sites, financed themselves with bank robberies. By 1970, 23 members of the FLQ were in prison, 4 convicted of murder. The movement crushed in October. The movement never did end. It went to voters saying yes or no. That's me in Quebec City a couple of years ago. Nice city, Quebec City. And you will see in most of Quebec, the official language of Quebec is French. New Brunswick, it's French and English. Most of the signs are in French with the exception of federal buildings where the signs are bilingual. Eventually, the Quebecois would form part of the Quebecois and go ahead and try to get independence or greater autonomy. There's always the problem with French and English, which started in the 1750s. And Quebec wanted more autonomy to keep their language separate, distinct language. And they have tried to do it through the vote over the years. In Northern Ireland, problems started in 1960. Northern Ireland wanted to get rid of the rest of Ireland. A lot of what they said was prejudice against them as Catholics. And they studied what Martin Luther King did in the United States, 1970, the second year of resistance. Northern Ireland conflict, 70 to 72, wasn't, though, nonviolent. There was an explosion of there was a political explosion. The conflict began in 1969 during a campaign to end discrimination against Catholic nationalist minority by the Protestant Unionist government and police force. That would culminate in 1972 with Bloody Sunday. Initially, it was the English going in for a few days in 1969. They would stay there until 1998 when George Mitchell, the former Senate Majority Leader, the Democrat from Maine, would broker a truce between the two sides. Women's strike, march down Fifth Avenue from 59th Street, from Central Park to Bryant Park. Women's strike, August 26th. Of 1970 to coincide with the women's right to vote in the 1920 presidential election, although not all women got the right to vote in the 1920 election. Chinese came later. Anyway, the women's strike for equality, Betty Friedan, was a strike which took place in the United States August 26, 1970, celebrating the passage of the 19th Amendment, which effectively gave most American women the right to vote. There is Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1962-63, and by 1966 formed the National Organization of Women. The strike spearheaded by Betty Friedan had 3 goals: free abortion on demand, equal opportunity in the workforce, and free childcare. One thing that they did not have, which women didn't have in 1970, was equal opportunity in education. In 1970, at the Miss Universe contest in London, rather Miss World beauty pageant in London at the Royal Albert Hall, hosted by Bob Hope, 50 women hurled smoke bombs, stink bombs, and ink bombs at the contestants on stage. That the continuation of what started in 1968, protesting the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City. And that was the bra birthing movement at that point, which got these people the attention. And I do ask the question of people when I'm live, did you ever burn your bra in the late 60s? You should hear some of the answers. They're great. What, are you crazy? You know how much one of those costs and how difficult it is to get one that's proper fitting? You're a man, you wouldn't know. Was one of them. Another woman said, look at me now, does it matter? But it was an effective PR tool because it got interest, the bra burning, and that was the slogan for a while. All items like bra burning and other entrapments like that, they got their message out. That is William Safire, the darling of the New York Times editorial page because of his weekly word Smith column, not an opinion piece, talking about words and all, which was syndicated around the country. So you got in Chicago. Life magazine, Agnew on the warpath. It was William Safire who put the words into Spiro Agnew, the vice president's mouth. The war against 1969, network TV, news anchors, and in 1970, the entire media. I'll do this radio style, Agnew. Dateline, September 11th, 1970, San Diego, Spiro Agnew. In the United States today, we have more than our share of the nattering nabobs of negativism. Agnew criticized his opponents and the press. The words written by William Safire, who went on as a media member, a New York Times columnist. The last major outrageous musical event was in England, the Isle of Wight, 1970, August 26. Some of the Woodstock Monterey veterans like Jimi Hendrix, Richie Havens, who had the longest fingernails I ever saw in a human. I should actually put up the picture we have with Richie Havens. Anyway, Jimi Hendrix there, The Who, The Doors, Chicago, Richie Havens, John Sebastian, Joan Baez, who retired last year, 10 years after Emerson, Lake and Palmer, the Moody Blues, and Jethro Tull, all at the Isle of Wight. Janis Joplin would die from a drug overdose. Jimi Hendrix choked on drug-induced vomit, two of the rock and roll deaths in 1970. Sesame Street started on November 15th, 1969. But there were some people in Mississippi who were trying to get rid of Sesame Street in Mississippi, which is a tough deal to do because the public, the PBS stations were in New Orleans, Louisiana, in Mobile, Alabama, up in Memphis, Tennessee, and there were some over on the western side in Oklahoma. Really, the only stations they were targeting, Jackson, Mississippi, and a couple others within Mississippi. A state commission in Mississippi in 1970 voted to ban Sesame Street, get it off the air because of its highly integrated cast of children. It never worked. Here in New York, McSorley's Bar. McSorley's Bar was a man-only bastion for many years. McSorley's Old Ale House, the oldest Irish tavern in New York City, founded in 1854. They didn't allow women inside until Betty Friedan's group decided to sue, and that happened in 1970. McSorley said, you know what, we don't want the lawsuit. You want to come in here and smell the place and walk on the sawdust on the floor and sweat like everybody else, you're welcome to do the same thing. And they did. Chicago 7, the Chicago 7, they extended into 1970. In February of 1970, all of the defendants who were arrested during the Chicago Democratic National Convention in 1968 are acquitted of conspiracy, although 5 of them are convicted of inciting a riot. They were sentenced to 5 years in prison each, given $5,000 each in fines. That was overturned in 1971. There is Howard Cosell. I am still friendly with Colin and Justin Cosell, his grandchildren, and another grandchildren who's an grandchild who is an ESPN attorney, Jared. So I first met Howard in the 1980s, and we ended up becoming acquaintances, and I still carry that on to this day with his grandchildren. Anyway, Monday Night Football started on ABC TV with the Cleveland Browns playing the New York Jets and Joe Willie Namath, and Howard Cosell was the star of the show, and he needed a foil. which was Dandy Don Meredith. Now remember, I talked about Lester Maddox, and there's a twist in all this. Lester Maddox is the segregationist who is the governor of Georgia. Muhammad Ali, he's in exile since April of 1967 from boxing. He has his boxing license taken away, stripped actually, so he can't fight, and all his titles are taken away after he refuses to go into the armed forces. 1967. He's looking to get back into boxing, and he's doing all the research and research and research. And guess what? Georgia doesn't have a boxing commission. Lester Maddox could have blocked a fight if Ali wanted to go to Georgia, as many other state boxing commissions could do. But Lester Maddox sits this out. In Atlanta, Ali could come back and fight. The only approval needed, the mayor, Sam Massel, who had been in office less than a year. On October 26, 1970, Muhammad Ali is back in the ring, and he fights Jerry Quarry and wins with a third-round technical knockout. Muhammad Ali is back. Kind of. We're still waiting for the Supreme Court to hear about him and overthrowing his conviction of refusing to go into the armed forces on religious basis. We're still waiting to see if the Supreme Court overturns that. And there is Ali in 1985 and me. My old friend, the late Shelley Saltman, who was one of Ali's promoters, told me that, and Shelley, if you're listening, yeah, I'm talking about you again. He said that Ali was totally sincere in his beliefs. Even though he was a boxer, in not going into the armed forces, a conscientious objector. Jim Boughton, there's me and Jim. The only time we spoke together, 2007 at Yogi Berra's museum, wrote the quintessential baseball book called Ball 4, where he basically pulled the curtain on baseball players. They were human beings after all. Rhodesia severs its last tie. By the way, the New York Public Library in Ball 4, one of the 20 most influential nonfiction books released in the 20th century. Rhodesia severs its last tie with the British Crown, declares itself a racially segregated republic. March 1st, 1970, Tonga and Fiji also gained independence from Britain. That's Allende in Chile, Salvador Guillermo Allende Gossens, a Chilean democratic socialist politician and physician, president of Chile from 70 to 73, head of the Popular Unity political coalition government, first ever Marxist to be elected president in a democracy. There was an attempt on Pope Paul VI's life, November 27th, 1970. He's wounded in the chest with a knife. A dagger-wielding Bolivian painter disguised as a priest tried to kill him. It's getting time to go. We're almost at the end. It's December 21st, 1970. It is the first day of winter, and Elvis finally gets what he wants, a meeting with Richard Nixon. That picture, the most requested picture from the Richard Nixon Library, Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California. E meets Dick. On December 21st, Presley meets with Nixon. Nixon gives Elvis what he wants. Elvis wants to get a badge from the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. His wife, Priscilla, later wrote that with the badge, Elvis thought he could legally enter any country wearing guns and carrying any drugs he wished, except he never performed anywhere. In fact, he never left the country except his days in Germany. See, there was a problem with his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, who was 50-50 partners with Elvis. See, he was an illegal alien, and he was afraid if Elvis left the country, and if he went with him, he'd never get back into the country. So Elvis, he never booked Elvis out of the country, except there were a couple of bookings in the 1950s in Toronto and Vancouver, and the Colonel didn't go. He didn't want to be tagged as an illegal immigrant and thrown out of the country. So he was Elvis's manager, and he made up a story about himself, and everybody accepted it. Oh yeah, there, look at the, why is that man smiling? Presley wrote to Nixon in his pitch to get there, I can and will do more good if I were made a federal agent at large, and I will help out by doing it my way. He wasn't the lounge act in Vegas quite yet, singing my way. My way. Through my communications with people of all ages. First and foremost, I'm an entertainer, but all I need is the federal credentials. He concluded by saying he would love to meet the president. His target, these guys, the Beatles. Why? They were very un-American. Well, the problem was the Beatles had broke up by this point, and they were un-American. They were English. The two men got along well during the meeting, and Presley's request for a badge was granted. During the meeting, Presley said he felt the Beatles exemplified an anti-American nature. The Beatles broke up in September of 1969. And if Elvis was paying attention, 10 days later, Paul McCartney would file a lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles. That's if Elvis was paying attention. Thank you so much. That was the year that was, 1970. And that is my press credential from 1980, my Secret Service press credential when, as a 23 and a 24-year-old, I was out there covering Ronald Reagan and Ted Kennedy. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments?
Yes, please feel free to raise your hand or type any messages in our chat box if you have any questions or comments.
Did you enjoy going your stroll through memory lane?
I did. It wasn't my memory lane, but I learned a lot.
Give them another minute. So.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank Katie, if we have nothing. Katie, thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, thank you so much.
And everybody else. I haven't seen the participants, so I don't have a, let me see who the attendees are. Thank you, Al. Thank you, Al and Sandy, Deb, Janet, Lawrence, Marilyn. It's like old romper room. And, romper, bumper, stomper, boo, tell me, who are you?
Marilyn just typed in our chat box. She enjoyed it, but she hopes there isn't a test. Which
no, there's no test. There's no test on it. It's just your memory and jogging your memory of those days. Although if I did give a test, people would have problems more than likely, because some people probably remember it totally different, depending on what side of the aisle that you were on. And then there would be the Elvis fans who, Elvis, what happened? Because after Elvis got out of the army, he made these awful movies, so cheesy. They were so cheesy, they were funny and all. But thank you, Marilyn. I appreciate that. So anyway, if nothing else, Katie, thank you for inviting me. Hope we can do this again at some point.
I definitely see it in our future. So,
and everybody else, have a good day. I got a grand total of 50 minutes off. And I got to do, I don't even know what I am doing. I know at 3 o'clock, I don't even know what I am doing. Hang on. I mean, I got 3 o'clock. I'm doing 2 talks. One at my time, 2 o'clock. On 1963, and at 3 o'clock, 1963, and tonight doing for a library how pro football evolved from gamblers, bootleggers, and other people you wouldn't necessarily want to hang out with to the National Football League. So yeah, that's it. 7 o'clock tonight, my time, 6 o'clock your time, and I did that talk last week. And there's a lot of Chicago in that talk with George Halas and the Green Bay Packers and Curly Lambeau and how actually the Green Bay Packers put up money so Halas could make a payroll. And if he doesn't make that payroll, Bears may be out of business during the Depression.
Oh.
So the Green Bay Packers, you might hate the Green Bay Packers, but without the Packers, there might not be any Bears right now. So anyway, thank you so much. Thank you, Katie, for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for putting up with me. And hopefully we will see you again in the near future. My name is Evan Weiner. Thank you so much, Katie. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye, everybody.